Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest instalment of the Dare Dallas webinar. Thank you ever so much for joining us. First of all, apologies. The last few weeks, we've all been incredibly busy and everyone's been here, there and everywhere. So it has been a bit of a strange one whereby we've recorded some. And last week, you had the pleasure of Aurelia introducing you as well, who will be doing another webinar fairly soon as well. And last week was great fun. Thank you ever so much for joining us. If you did manage to join us for that one where Jonathan and I had a kind of a bit of a role reversal and Jonathan was talking to me about guitars, which was great. And I think we've had some lovely comments about that. So thank you ever so much for joining us for that one. Now, this week we are back to Jonathan's forte, shall we say, although his brief segment at hosting was fantastic. We're back to Jonathan talking about art and painting. So if you haven't read Jonathan's latest article on affordable masterpieces, please do so, because it's a most engrossing read, and it gives a really, really good opinion on where you can actually look at some of these pictures that are, I think the title line was that you can afford them for less than the price of a second-hand car, which I think in some aspects is very true. So, Jonathan, first of all, good afternoon. It's lovely to see you.
Hi, nice to be back.
Always nice. Jonathan, the subject matter, obviously, we discussed this before you did the article, and I thought it was a really good subject matter to talk about, because there are a fantastic wealth of these items out there that are tremendously affordable, aren't they?
Yeah, I wanted to somehow give the impression that if all you ever read about is things that make multi-millions, you might quite reasonably assume that you just, why bother? You know, why could I couldn't possibly afford anything by Picasso or Renoir or any of the artists I write about, because it's all too expensive. But on a purely practical level, painters paint pictures. It takes them a certain amount of time to do it. Some of them take a long time. So if you're thinking even in basic terms of cash flow, they don't necessarily diversify, but they do produce other things in greater volumes. Okay, they may not be quite as individualistic as a finished painting, but it's there to make revenue and also build other markets for them.
It's part and parcel these days, and not just these days, but in the last 100 years or so, of being an artist, really, isn't it? That there are limited editions made, that there are prints. And if you haven't seen some of the webinars that Jonathan and I have done on, for example, with Larry and other things like that, there are some really, really good examples of that. So let's just have a look, first of all, at one of the things that not a lot of people might actually expect. So we're not actually going to be looking at a painting here, but what we're actually going to be looking at is what, Jonathan?
Well, yes, it's very good. It's a good place to start. Here is for the sharp-eyed among you, you might say, well, this looks like it's a 1930s footstool, the sort of thing that you not a hugely unusual, but there is a sense of design to it. And this is a piece by one of the most expensive modern painters of the 20th century and still currently so. That's Francis Bacon. You think of images that Francis produces of tortured popes and mutilated bodies and everything else you associate with him. But prior to the Second World War, in the early 30s, 1930 to 33 roughly, he was a furniture and rug designer.
And it's strange to think of him like that, isn't it? Because as you say, it's it's not what you would imagine from him.
No, it's so far apart, it would be a perfectly reasonable thing to assume that if you were given 20 guesses, you'd probably never come up with Francis Bacon. But this is part of a bedroom suite he designed in the 1931, I think it was. There's a circular mirror and a dressing table and something else. And this is laminated plywood. So it's like a lot of furniture at the time, it's pressed and steamed and bent into shape. And this one was given to the owner by Francis, or rather relatives of the owner by Francis in the 30s, and they looked after it. And this is quite a good survival. If you imagine you've got bedroom furniture, you sit on it, it gets a bit worn out. This was probably put in a safe place and survived very well.
It's interesting because I think with Francis Bacon, as far as furniture designers go, he was a fantastic painter. And you've got this, and do you think it would be worth as much money, or any money, in fact, were it not by Francis Bacon? I can't see anything particularly as individual as Francis Bacon is as a painter with this piece of furniture.
No, it's quite a hard one. I mean, if it were a generic piece of bedroom furniture from the 30s, you're probably looking at something worth, or would make about 300 or 400 quid tops.
Mm.
But because it's by Francis, it's over £15,000. I think this came up at auction 2 or 3 years ago. Was estimated at 10 to 15. Had what you and I, Alastair, might call a seamless provenance, given to a friend of Francis's in the 30s, then passed through their family and never been offered for sale. So it was fully attributable and in great condition. So it's a top price for this. But yes, it was £18,750. Yeah, it's not cheap, but at the same time, it is by Francis. It is a unique survival and a very nice thing to have if you want something different. I mean, you're going to confuse people, I guess, if they come into your living room and you say, would you like to see my Francis Bacon? And you point at that. But it is what it is, and it is by Francis, and it's something which is you may never have thought of.
Now, the next item we're going to have a quick look at, again, by Francis Bacon, but I think we're kind of slightly edging to more what one would consider to be more atypical, or not necessarily atypical, but kind of moving towards that trademark style of his.
Yeah, you're beginning to have a few more clues here in the imagery of this carpet, which is 2.5 by 4 meters, so it's quite substantial, so 4 meters high or long, and you can see from the colouring and that central sort of violin-shaped image, and particularly in the centre, the sort of striated pattern, you're beginning to see something that sort of is recognisable. His style doesn't fully develop until after the war in the late 40s, so it's not, you could still be it would still be reasonable to scratch your head for a while. But there's a few of these, and they're quite expensive, much more so than the chair we're looking at. You're looking here at something in the region of 150 to 200,000 pounds, and I understand that's out of many people's reach. But when you're looking at a major work by Francis at many tens of millions, okay, it's looking quite reasonable.
I think for something at 4 meters by 2 meters, that theoretically, if you've got a reasonable sized room, you could actually put on the wall as a piece of art even.
Yeah.
150, 200 grand for a Francis Bacon piece, I think is relatively good in the whole grand scheme of things. And it certainly does fall, if not into the affordable category, certainly the more affordable category. But let's continue.
It's certainly more explicable, isn't it, than the bedroom furniture. You could point at this and say, have you seen my Francis Bacon? And people would be certainly far less confused by this than the seat.
Oh, certainly. Now, the next one that we're going to have a look at here, obviously, is a little bit more what you would imagine, Jonathan.
Yeah. This is a very straightforward, for those of you who saw the Lowry webinar we did, these are high quality lithographic prints, and they are directly from original works by Francis. So they're a triptych. This is it's called second version triptych from 1944. And it is basically a replica, but in high quality printing. It appears like it's 3-in-1, but actually they're 3 separate images. They're not huge. They're sort of smaller than the original, so they're quite practical. Each one of the 3 is signed by Francis, so you have the artist's signature on each and every one. There are only 60. These were made in 1989. And I think they are really interesting. And I've seen one late last year in a really very important collection. And these 3 were in pride of place and didn't look any in any way out of place. I think they're stunningly. The thing I kick myself about is, and I'm telling you about these now, but I remember 10 or 15 years ago looking at this set when it was about £1,000 and thinking, I really
gosh.
These. And I think I should buy these. Now you're looking at 20,000 or more, because I think people weirdly are now waking up to the value that these offer. There are a few issues that, condition and so on, but there's only 60 in the set, so you're not going to see them every day. And
I was going to say, it's a really low print number, isn't it? 60. I mean,
yeah.
I think we talked about this in our Lowry webinar as well. Sorry to come back to it, but
okay.
The fact that they are all signed, and it's a low edition number, it's about as close as us mere mortals are probably going to be able to get realistically to owning a signature piece by one of these artists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. That's why it's here really for us to see, because it's as close as mere mortals are likely to get to owning a triptych. And using the example of the collection that I saw it in, where indeed there were some really very important pictures by other artists, this sat very well and very comfortably. I think they stand up well to being displayed. They offer, dare I say, good value here, and yes, an opportunity. I mean, a triptych of the original triptych is going to be what, $50 million, something like that. It's it's bonkers money really for most people.
And the statement that we were saying earlier is, oh, have a look at my Francis Bacon. I think if you took somebody into the room and they saw that, they would probably know a lot better than the stool or the carpet, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they'd have got there before you. Hopefully. It's what I would call a signature piece. It's blindingly obvious, unless you live your life under a stone, that this is connected to Francis Bacon in some way. And the edition, I mean, if you think there are 60 of these, each one is signed and numbered. This one happens to be number 31. On a sort of, on a logical basis, if there are 60, the likelihood of all 60 still surviving intact is probably not. So it's probably not even 60 if you start to think about it. It's probably 10 have got lost or burnt or forgotten about. So there's probably less than 60 in reality.
No, it's a nice thing to own, and it has its own rarity. And it is, as we said, as close as you are going to get to owning the original. And obviously, it was approved by the artist because they've been signed by him.
Yes, so, absolutely. Yes,
that is a nice touch, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, moving on with Francis Bacon, I think the next one is one of my favourite images by Bacon, actually, and it is the next couple. I think are so atypical of his work, and I just find them really, really fascinating. And this again, a good value statement piece.
Yeah. Again, a signature piece, clearly recognisable as a work by Francis. This is from the self-portrait series, and he's sitting in an interior here. And this is from the 70s, 1977. Slightly large edition. This is an edition of 180, but again limited, numbered. This is number 36, and again it is signed. The last triptych inevitably was more expensive because there are 3. This usually comes in at about 15 or 16,000 pounds. They don't come up that often, but you probably would expect to see 2 or 3 a year coming up. So there's a reasonable chance you could have a crack at one if it came up.
Jonathan, just to ask a question here, with the numbers on print runs, and again to go back, because it's a good comparison with Lowry, because Lowry was obviously known for the limited edition prints that were put out with him. Now with Lowry, there were certain circumstances where there was one print run done, and then maybe 10, 15 years later, there was a slightly different print run done, maybe with a slightly different printer, or ones that were signed, ones that were unsigned. With Bacon, is it, for want of a better word, less populated with things? So there's less of them, and were there fewer prints?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. As I mentioned earlier, this was really a commercial venture on behalf of the artist, who would be paid a fee for allowing the image to be used, and probably a fee for signing them. And for those people, my interest in art extends to the artists themselves. I think the whole thing is fascinating. Can you be a great artist by being a regular person? Well, almost certainly not. So Francis, I imagine just to get him into a room to sign these was probably difficult enough. So that the numbers are probably limited by virtue of his, you know, his attention span, which was that of a gnat. So yeah, I think that, you know, you're absolutely right. I think there are fewer of these than Lowry. Lowry did at least have the patience to sit in a room and sign, you know, 600 of these bloody things, whereas I just can't ever see Francis doing that. I'm not sure that's why the runs are the numbers they are, but you know,
I think you've hit the nail on the head with
yeah.
Francis and Lucian, who we'll come on to later. You can't imagine them, as you say, sitting in a room and being totally happy about signing lots of prints.
There'll be a degree
it's not really how you envisage them. Just on a practical point, and I think we did briefly touch on this with the Lowry situation. What is and how does it affect these items, artist resale rights? Because it's something that's been on kind of everyone's lips for the last 10 years now, pretty much.
Yeah, but you would pay if you bought this really in any set of circumstances. You bought this print or any of the prints we've been looking at so far, you would pay artist resale right on that. So it'll be, you probably see if it's in a gallery, it'll be priced at X, and it will say, you know, price 15,000 plus artist resale rights, which will add probably about £3,000 or £4,000 on top of the purchase price, which will go back to the Francis Bacon estate eventually through agencies.
That's the thing, isn't it? It does eventually supposedly go back to the estate of the artist, doesn't it? And
it was originally designed to help artists who had sold something once. So there's no artist resale. If you or I are artists and we exhibit and someone buys our work for the first time, there's no ARR, there's no artist resale right to pay. It's only on subsequent or later sales, and that's not limited by number. So it could be any number of later sales.
So, for example, a good example, I suppose, is so for those living artists who resell work, whereby initially it may not have made a huge amount of money, but in later years their work starts to make a bit more money, it goes up, and when it gets to a certain level, they will start to receive an income from the sale of those pictures. It's
true, and so they would be used to never seeing any more income again after they'd sold something. They just watch it sell. So if you're David Hockney or whatever, subsequent sales of your work, you're not going to see the vast chunk of money that it makes, but you will see the artist resale right coming back to you a little bit further down the line at some point.
So it's fantastic for those struggling artists such as Banksy and David Hockney then.
It was originally designed to help the struggling artists. And of course, like so many things in life, that's not quite how it's panned out. And right at the beginning, David Hockney was objected to it. He said he didn't think it was appropriate, but probably, you know, if you start to look at it over the year, it probably is quite a considerable amount of checks popping in the post, and you can stick them in your pension pot and probably it's all right.
Let's move on to the next Francis picture, which again, signature piece and very typical of his work.
Yeah, this is another signature picture. I've tried to sort of focus on things that are recognizable, and this is a curious composition. That sort of semi-winged figure is a sphinx, and the other figure, I'm not quite sure, it's a model, I guess, and he's been using one of his magazines with injuries to produce the bleeding plaster cast. It's called Eclipse and the Sphinx, for what it's worth, but it's again a recognizable image. This is from 1980, and I think it's slightly cheaper than the others. It was 8,000, just over £8,000 when it was sold.
A good size, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just over 1.2 meters, so it's 127 by 90 centimeters. So it's going to cover quite a nice space on your wall, and be quite a trophy piece. And you know, it has nice colours too. I know this is perhaps not the be all and end all, but you know, it's a very colourful and still very modern piece.
But I think if you're going to buy something like this, having strong, bold colours on it, especially with that kind of that pastel-y kind of pink colour, I think is important, isn't it? You know, that's why just looking at it, because obviously this was done in 1980. There are a lot of prints that I've seen whereby you go back 40, 50 years, and in some circumstances, the print quality is not as good as it is nowadays, for example, and you're never going to get as close, and that there are things that are kind of, you know, slightly, you know, just off. But with these things, would you say they will be of, you know, good, very good quality for that period of time?
Yeah, I think you probably need to bear in mind it's that they will need looking after. So if they're in good condition when you buy them, which is my recommendation, that you know, make sure the condition is good. In other words, there are no stains and the colouring is still reasonably strong, and look after them, keep them out of strong light, and have them framed and mounted appropriately. There's all of those things, but they should last well, certainly as long as any other work on paper.
Fascinating. Now we're going to move on to another Freud here. However, this is a little bit different. Now, you and I, Jonathan, have been very privileged over the last year to actually come across some fantastic original Lucian sketches and Lucian drawings and things like this. But this is a print again, but a fairly hefty price tag for this print, isn't it, really?
Yeah. You're looking at a print which generally at auction they're usually estimated at between 40 and 60,000 pounds. This particular one made 68,000, so just around the top end of the estimate. It's an etching by Lucian Freud of his dog Pluto. He seemed always to have whippets, and this is another whippet. And Pluto appears in pictures and in drawings, and in this case, obviously, in etchings. And we were talking about numbers earlier. This is number 40. It's number 46 from an edition of 46. Quite an unusual number, but there you go.
Does that make a big difference? Because usually, obviously, 1 and 2, or you've got an artist proof, and then 1 and 2, or something along those lines. But does 46 of 46 make a big difference?
I don't think it does, really. I mean, you'd like to think it does, but in my experience, it doesn't particularly. There'll be. I mean, these are prints. If you go back to Francis Bacon's work we were talking about, there is a consistency there. You're going to see very little difference between one of Francis's colour prints and another. Whereas with these, they are hand printed. It's on a different type of paper. It's a slightly softer, almost spongier paper. And you've got to go back to ink the plates. So yes, they are essentially the same, but there'll be ever so slight differences one to the other. There might be slightly stronger images. So I only say that just to point out there's a slight degree of uniqueness in every single one of these, which I quite
like. There's more of a physical connection to the artist maybe than a mechanical printing process.
Yes, I mean, there's no way that Francis was churning out the prints, whereas Lucian Freud is working on the zinc plate from which this is taken. The etching basically is there's two processes. There's dry etching and etching using an acid. So Francis is, in this case, Lucian is drawing the image of the dog and the hand directly onto the printing plate itself into a waxed surface, and they apply acid, which creates the image when you add ink. So and indeed he'll probably have a few goes at it too. So there'll be early prints, which are trial proofs and so on. So there's some interesting elements to collecting these prints.
Lucian Freud liked to kind of pass on things, where works in progress and things like that. And you see them come up occasionally in private collections, don't you, from sketches where he was working on certain aspects. So I don't think it would be unusual for some of the trial pressings or something like that of these to come out, would it?
No, not at all. You're absolutely right. They're essentially a limited edition, and this is numbered and signed by Lucian. And sometimes there are also inscriptions as well. And one of the benefits, if you like, with Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud would be given something which you mentioned earlier, the artist proof. Let's ask ourselves the question, what is an artist proof? Well, it's sort of that. It's given to the artist as sort of more or less a freebie, I guess. So they will come to him or her as the artist's proof, and they are theirs to do with as they will. So it's
I think from what I understand of it, it's almost a case of it's something that's given to them to say, okay, this is what we're going to be churning out. Do you like it? Kind of scenario.
Yeah, yes. And it goes back a lot. It goes back, this type of limited edition printing goes back to 1920s. There was a huge sort of, here we are 100 years later and it's still going on. I mean, it sort of answers your question of earlier, will this last? I think it will. We're still doing limited edition prints well over 100 years after they first began to emerge.
Now, the next thing by Lucian that we have, which I think is a marvel, and I think is actually a bit of a bargain when you think about the artist and the importance of Lucian's work, is this. What first of all, Jonathan, what is it? Because a lot of people might not recognise what it is.
What is it? Well, it's an artist's palette. So in other words, the hole that you see at the centre of the bottom is where you stick your thumb, and the hand then supports effectively this piece of wood. And as the artist works, he or she will mix the colours on this palette. For the sharp-eyed among you and those who are familiar with Lucian Freud's work, well, here are some very typical pigments that he uses. So this is actually a palette that was not only belonged to Lucian Freud, but was used during his work on portraits of I don't know what you would call him really, Lee Bowery. It was a performance artist, a designer, a costume designer, sort of just an icon really. And he's someone who appears in Lucian Freud's paintings and etchings over a number of years, and was given by Lucian to Lee Bowery's now widow, but then wife at the time. And it was subsequently sold. In fact, I was involved in selling this, which was very exciting. I was working at the auction house at the time that sold this, and it was really, a lot of people came to see it. And I think it probably is a bargain. I think we had estimated it at £6,000 to £8,000, and it made 11,250. So slightly beyond our expectations, but not hugely so. I've just got some notes here. It was given to Nicola Bowery, who's Lee Bowery's wife, and it was after Lucian completed a picture called Anne the Bridegroom, which features Lee Bowery. I think he's naked in it, and he's quite sort of a larger than life figure, so he's very, very distinctive. Lucian was brilliant at choosing distinctive and significant models. This is a fun thing.
And I think the great thing about it as well is, I think you can tell it's been used, but I think you can also tell that it looks like it's been used more than once, which is quite nice. So, whilst obviously it's catalogued as being from that specific painting, I can't imagine Lucian being the type of guy to go, okay, well, it's a new painting, I'll get a new board for my palette this time. So it's
there's not much room there, is there? He used the palette to mix his colours, and also a palette to get rid of spare paint. But also, if you look at photographs of his house, mostly by David Dawson, his assistant, he used the curtains, the floor, the wall, almost anything else to wipe his brushes on. It's a sort of look like a war zone when he's painting.
I was going to say, I think if you look at any of those photos, you'll see that the entire place is covered in paint, and maybe intentionally and maybe not, but you wouldn't want to be the person that sands his floorboards after some of the work.
Well, you might not sand them, mightn't you? If you happen to move into a house that Lucian lived in, then you probably wouldn't touch if you found.
I think you'd probably varnish them and keep them as they are, wouldn't you?
Yes, it would be like to see my Lucian Freud paint on the floor and the wall and the ceiling.
Right, let's go back to something a little bit more traditional and a bit more in keeping with what we've been talking about in general. Now, this again is another etching, so in the similar manner to Pluto. But what can you tell us about this one, Jonathan?
Well, this is Esther Freud, one of Lucian's children, and is, to my mind, a very sensitive and beautiful portrait. There are oil paintings of Esther. It was painted, or this print was made in 1991, and just to contrast it with Pluto, the dog we just saw, there's a real lightness of touch which you can see in here. It looks as near as damn it like a drawing, but it's an etching, so it's very delicately. I mean, one of the many things I'd love to be able to do is to draw, and I've managed over the years to establish that I'm terrible at drawing and can't draw. and Lucian draws beautifully. There's a real sort of sensitivity in all his work throughout his life, and I think this is a really nice example. It's
real, isn't it? It's very real, and there's no artistic. It is exactly what it is, and I hate to use some warts and all, but that's effectively what it is, isn't it? Now, obviously, because it's a member of his family, do you think that there is, again, another slight connection to it? But also, do you think, because this is, again, relatively cheap in the whole grand scheme of things, so it's about $8,500 compared to Pluto, which was quite a distinct amount more, and this is a lower number. So do you think that the subject matter is still as important? So effectively, people prefer dogs to daughters?
Yeah, I think it's probably true. I think this is cheap, personally. I mean, it's a limited edition of, I think it's 35 or 25.
25, yeah.
25, isn't it? But it is quite small. It's 21 by 20. So, size may make a difference here, but I think it's eminently affordable. Now, interestingly, I think Lucian died in 2011. And it's fair to say that prices now are softer than they were then, probably from about 2005, 2006 onwards. Prices for original work by Lucian and etchings sort of just got stronger and stronger. They're now softer. So if you like, prices may go up and down. What I noticed preparing for this was that not that prices are right down, but there are some opportunities out there that things are a bit cheaper than they were. And after Lucian died, there seemed to be a sort of a lull, if you like, and that often happen with an artist, that he or she, there's either a sort of gathering prior to when they die, or sometimes people will suddenly remember and buy afterwards. It's a bit random, but I think this offers real value.
Do you think then that now is a time to buy? Obviously, I'm not going to put you on the spot and say.
It's a good question. No, it's a very fair question. I think it is. It seems to me that if you want something which it's not a drawing, but it is an etching which Lucian worked on himself, and it's as near. So apart from doing the print, which Lucian probably would have supervised the way that the ink is applied. Apart from that, it's only one step removed from being a drawing, and it's signed by him and numbered. I think it's really a good buy.
It's as close as you are going to get. And if you are a fan of Lucian's work of over sensational realist figures and things like this, that's probably about as close as you're going to get in terms of that style of thing as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and for those of us, those buyers out there of a nervous disposition who would say, well, what do I pay? I'm not really sure. These days with the internet, it would take you probably 10 minutes to establish what others exactly like this have made. So you can be reassured, if you like. All of these are in a catalogue raisonné, so you're not worrying about copies or forgeries or whatever else. They're numbered, so you've got a degree of consistency there, and you can see, oh, I see one like that made X amount, then I'm prepared to pay that and a bit more. You can track your buying more because they're multiples. It's more reassuring, if that makes sense. A unique piece, well, you pay what you pay because you like it or whatever. But here you can track and then track the market after you bought it. Obviously, you can see, well, are they going up and down and so on.
Just like any other investment, it's something.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right, we're going to move on now, Jonathan. I'm aware that sometimes our webinars do tend to go on a little bit longer than some of us anticipate. But I think a good subject now to kind of move on to is possibly Hull's finest export, maybe after the House Martins, I don't know. But we'll have a quick look at a David Hockney now.
Yeah. Well, I have unashamedly chosen all of my favourite artists for this particular presentation, just in case any of you hadn't noticed. And I just think David Hockney, who is born in 1937, so he really is an extraordinary 80-plus-year-old, is still making art in inventive ways. I chose this.
Actually, last month I bought a David Hockney, his first digital print that he'd done.
Yeah.
And I bought one of those last month. It wasn't a lot of money, and he's still obviously making waves in doing what he does.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, congratulations to you. I think you're very, very wise. It's part of the reason for putting these up. These are all, I think, pieces which are currently coming up for sale. I thought rather than say what something has made, these are all coming up in the next sort of week or two at various locations. This one is estimated at 6,000 to 8,000. It is what David calls it's on an office copier, so it's two sheets of paper joined, and it's from the photocopy machine, not the photocopy, but his printer, and it's from 1986, and it's signed, dated, and numbered 16 out of 60. So there's 60 of them. And David has made them, and they seem eminently affordable.
I think it's a curious thing with Hockney, because again, he was very much he is an artist, not just a conceptual artist. He does paint and he does a lot of things. However, he does use different mediums and explores different kind of avenues quite a lot, doesn't he? Like visuals and video stuff. I think he actually did a video piece literally about 100 yards from my front door at one point in Lincolnshire. And he's very well known for just using different mediums.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably 15, 20 years ago now. I used to regularly visit an extraordinary man called Jonathan Silver, who had bought and run Salt's Mill in Bradford, which is an old not working when he bought it, but it had been a cotton milling town, literally built from the ground up to make cotton. And I went to visit Jonathan, who's a friend of David Hockney's, and still has a museum and Hockney feature where you can go and see David's work just outside, just in the centre of Bradford, actually. And while I was visiting him, the fax machine was just going constantly as one after the other piece of A4 was spewing out, and there was an intern in Jonathan's office arranging what David was doing from Los Angeles. So as we're talking and having our meeting, if that's what you call it, this page after page was taking up this enormous working mill floor. So what started very small ended up, I think it was a 10 by 12 A4 piece, just emerging, this piece of art emerging on the floor as he laid it out. It's extraordinary.
Fantastic concept, isn't it? Now,
yeah.
With this piece of Hockney artwork, for example, I mean, obviously this was produced in the 80s. Have these come up for sale regularly in the past 40 years, or is this one that's literally just hit the market fairly fresh?
I think these are just starting to emerge. So no, they haven't come before. I think what we're seeing now is a quite interesting embrace, if you like, of other things other than what you might call traditional prints. And why shouldn't we? That I think is David's gift to the world, that making people think differently about artwork. And so there aren't that many of these. And it is, I think, typically a work by David Hockney. It's not unusual, like the furniture from Francis Bacon we saw at the beginning. I would say there's some real opportunities here. And no, they don't come up that often, as far as I can tell.
No, it's a fun thing. Now I'm going to come on to the next Hockney, which is a piece from his iPad, which strangely I bought another piece that he had done from his iPad. But yes, similar to this. But, yeah. And I thought it wasn't a lot of money for what it was. And I think in the same vein, I think Hockney has always been incredibly well known for being at the cutting edge, or at least moving with the times and doing things digitally and doing other bits and bobs. And I think this is a really good example of how he's moved with the times. And, you know, his work works well with different kind of mediums and new mediums.
Yeah, yeah. This is. I mean, you can't. Well, I suppose you could, but I can't think of any other artists who are quite so up to the minute to produce works on their iPads. And this is. I've actually seen this piece, and it is a very beautiful thing. Inevitably, it's probably, you might think it's iPad size, but it isn't. It's 44 by 30 centimeters, so it's bigger than iPad. So don't think that the iPad confines its size, because when it prints up, it comes up bigger. No, it's a really nice thing.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think the thing to remember as well is we're looking at all these artists, and David Hockney is the only one in this entire list that is actually still alive and still putting out interesting and, you know, essential pieces that are coming out of the market now, that they're still relevant, aren't they?
Yeah, he's almost unstoppable. This is estimated at 7,000 to 10,000, which I think is very reasonable. And there are some other pieces coming up. I would say if you're even half interested after this, to go and look what else is coming up out there, because they're super things to own, and you could have a very nice little collection for not much money, which is very typical of David's work.
Absolutely. Well, enough of Hockney. We're now going to move on to something which I suppose we have to describe as being a little bit more traditional and a little bit more 19th century, obviously. So let's have a look at this. And Jonathan, what can you tell us about this?
Well, this amused me because, you know, I thought, wouldn't it be nice if some of our webinar viewers could think to themselves, I'll when I next have a dinner party, I'll bring people over to see my Renoir. And here it is. You know, you just close your eyes and think, well, everything by Renoir costs a fortune. Oddly enough, it doesn't, and works on paper, and small oil paintings are sort of affordable. The small oil might be 60 or 80,000 pounds, which is a lot of money. But I started to look for more affordable things, and this is a lithograph. So rather like the etching we were talking about earlier that Lucian did, the lithograph, it's basically a drawing on usually limestone done by the artists, and then, yes, it's printed by someone else. But again, there's not many steps between Renoir making this drawing and then producing a print of it in a rather wonderful, slightly purpley brown sepia tone. This was made about 1904. Renoir died in 1919, so we know that he was alive when it was made and could well have seen the production run, but certainly he would have made the original drawing onto the stone. And this is another thing that's coming up. It's estimated at £1,000 to £1,500, and
which is kind of, to be honest, throwaway money for something that is, you know, to own something that is as close as you are going to get to a Renoir.
You can say to your friends and family, here is my Renoir, and it is exactly that. It's a limited edition. Okay, there are 1,000 of them, but of that 1,000, I bet you less than half have survived the last 100 years. So they're relatively rare things. And, you know, I think it's a really good buy.
Now, the next ladder up from this effectively is it's a slightly more detailed piece with a little bit more going on and a little bit less in terms of the amount of print run. So it gives you that little bit more exclusivity, and just for a little bit more money, you can have this, can't you?
Yeah, I just thought this was a reasonable contrast. Again, this is a signature piece, as was the nude. These girls in hats are very typical of the last part of the 19th century. This was lithograph was made in 1897, and we were talking about limited editions. Well, this was a limited edition of 100 back in 1897, and is a really, really beautiful drawing. I don't know how easily you can see it on your screens here, but there's a delicacy and design here that's really only Renoir could do. An estimate guide on this was, when I looked at it, between £4,000 and £6,000.
And again, for something of that period, and that low print
Yeah.
time, I think is a good buy, and it's a good size as well. It's a little bit more it's a little bit more in your face than maybe the smaller one as well.
You're right. It's 60 by 50 centimeters, so it's a bit more substantial than the last one. But I included Renoir because it just may not have occurred to people that you can get things at this affordable level for a very traditional painter, and people's tastes are different. We've been talking mainly about contemporary art, but this is effectively post-impressionism, and there are examples to look for here too.
Now, what some people might not imagine as well is it's not necessarily just flat art. And again, with one of the artists, one of the best known artists in the world, and what people know him for best is probably not the actual item that we're going to bring up now, and that's this. And obviously it's Picasso, but not a lot of people knew he made some pots as well, didn't he?
Yeah, not a lot of people know this. I mean, Picasso for me, and for Picasso defines modern art. I mean, that we end with Picasso because it basically defines what we're talking about. He is the single artist who, from the beginning of the 20th century to his death in 1973, is just tracks all the major developments, and in some cases is entirely responsible for them. And at various times, in order to, it seems crass to say make money, but here is a ceramic jug which is hand painted and designed and signed. So it's a limited edition jug, or a pitcher, if you like. It's 50 centimeters high, I think, no, 30 centimeters high. 30
centimeters, yeah.
So it's not too big. It doesn't take up much space, but you can see it's hard to see in this particular example 100%, but you can see that there are Picasso influences, and it's while he's living and working in France he produces these, and then there are plates, there are bowls, there are all sorts of things. It becomes a whole sort of new thing for him to do. It almost re-energizes him. So this is limited to a 350. This is estimated at 5,000 to 8,000. It's signed Picasso, although we don't see it in the image. So here we have another element, if you like, of ways to own a Picasso for a lot less money than you thought of.
I like this because it's imaginative, it's a little bit unexpected. And again, I think for the money that you're paying for it, it's relatively exclusive, isn't it, really? For that kind of money to have a Picasso of that run is pretty good. And again, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but how many do you think have been smashed in transit over the years? And I imagine it's probably a decent percentage, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say if you say there are 350 in the edition, which there are, each one is numbered. This is number 111. Probably it could be that only half of that number actually survive because they got lost or dropped or whatever else. So they're even a bit rarer than you think they are.
No, I think it's a lovely thing, and an imaginative purchase as well as, obviously, flat art is, great. This is just a little bit more imaginative. But sticking with,
you could just, I mean, for people watching, you could just decide to collect those. There's enough material in the ceramics alone for you to live out your days collecting them. I mean, he is nothing if not
ceramics.
Yeah, he's nothing if not productive. I mean, the energy of Picasso and his ability to draw and make art is just breathtaking.
Jonathan, we're going to come on to this image now. So we're sticking with Picasso here, but what can you tell us about this?
This is an aquatint, which is again a type of printing not totally dissimilar to etching. So I've just chosen this because it's just one step removed from the artist. And aquatint is a curious process to describe, but basically it's the artist, in this case Picasso, making an image from I guess his head or something that he's seen. It's a bullfight, and you can see the bullfighters in the foreground. And it's again a limited edition, in this case 250, made by him in 1957, so after the Second World War, but still at a time when he's producing great art. and estimated, I thought rather temptingly, at £800 to £1,200. So hopefully for lots of you watching out here, it's getting harder and harder to think I won't buy anything, because that sort of seems eminently cheap to me. 34 by 50 centimeters, so a decent size without being huge. So you should be able to find somewhere to hang it in your home.
Again, but Picasso prints, I think you seem to see more of them. I do see a lot of the Doves and some of the other ones that that were produced not en masse, but a reasonable print number of them. And I think people are you can put them in any house as well. And again, it's that fantastic wow factor of when you have the people from 3 doors down over for supper on a Friday night. You can say, "Do you want to come and have a look at my Picasso?" And it's for that kind of money, it's better than a very standard decorator's piece that you'd probably pay the same amount for.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are probably things. I mean, you hear, what is it, the Antiques Roadshow moment where the person, or Flog It maybe, where the person says, I'm selling this now because it doesn't fit with my surroundings or doesn't fit in my home. But if you had a few of these, they probably would make a home in some ways, because they add rather than subtract, and they are still to this day. Okay, they're produced in the 50s, but they look modern. I think Picasso will always look modern.
I should say with that print, specifically the one that we're looking at, if you have a household that doesn't fit with a black and white print, then there's something inherently wrong with your designer.
Yeah, and you can rightly claim it's Picasso. I mean, he will have made this drawing, and there are not that many. It's limited, and again, probably a few have slipped away over the years. And I would hope that if people are enthusiastic, it's something that you could really enjoy, because it's not, yes, it's about owning it, but it's not just about owning, because you get sucked into it and you find yourself learning.
Absolutely. Jonathan, this has been fascinating. I'm just going to put a few questions to you.
Sure.
That have been asked. So with the exception of Renoir, I'm assuming, did you ever meet any of these artists?
Yes. I did meet Francis Bacon, if you call it a meeting. At the time I was working in London, in South Kensington, and Francis's studio is in Rees Mews, just over Old Brompton Road. And there was a supermarket we all went to get our lunch, and I queued up and chatted to Francis in the queue for the checkout in the supermarket in the Old Brompton Road. And he had, I remember very clearly what he had in his shopping basket: a wire basket with a bottle of whiskey and a box of cornflakes in it. That sums up his dietary habits, no doubt. And it's probably explained some of his mindset. He was in his 80s. I think the thing that I remember, and the fact that he looked, for a man of his age, he looked so much younger. And I thought for years after that, I thought that he had found some sort of elixir of life, until I mentioned it to another specialist friend who said, yes, that's because he wore makeup. So I realized now that he had gone out shopping, but had gone out with his makeup on. So he did look perhaps a bit better close to than he would otherwise have done.
That puts to bed my idea for a diet of cornflakes and scotch.
Yeah, yes. He had not found any magic elixir, just a bit of a foundation and eyeliner.
Jonathan, you said obviously that we were talking about these pictures, and you've been very fortunate enough to actually give examples of some of your favourite artists and some of their favourite. But are there any within that you really do hanker to own, or that are your personal favourites?
Yeah, I think it probably has to be Lucien Freud. There's something, and I did meet him on a number of occasions. He used to come in and view previews, and was very quiet and discreet for someone with such quite a tiny sort of wasp-like, almost willowy character, a forceful painter, but really quite almost not frail, but just very delicate physical presence. But you just found yourself, well, I certainly found myself just wanting to listen to what he had to say, but always very interested in art. So I think something by Lucien Freud, I think I would absolutely love to own.
I think artists like that have always been described as having somewhat of an aura, despite not having a huge physical presence. There's always something about them that's there.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly true of Lucien.
Jonathan, do you think, I mean, obviously we've seen some massive changes in the last 18 months, obviously due to the situation that we are in at the moment and hopefully we'll be out of fairly soon. But do you see things changing? Obviously, we had that brief discussion there about, you know, an artist's work can go down after they've died, which is rare. Do you think with any of these artists there's a possibility that things are going to change dramatically in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think that somehow or other lockdown has persuaded people to do things online, and art. When you look at the changes, we've talked about this before in webinars, and I've written about it. The changes now. I mean, I've been in the art business well over 40 years, and I've seen it change from, in my very early days, an exclusive club almost that you knew where to go, what to buy, you knew a few people you could buy stuff, to now when indeed it's almost completely demystified and available. I can only think that will simply make it more interesting for people, more available. Young people are used to buying things via eBay and other portals, and a lot of the auction houses, both internationally and even locally, are making things easier. I just see that it will, you know, the more people that buy art, the more interested they will become, and I can see it will work well over time. I can see that it will infuse other people. You know, in other words, if you bought something for the first time and you're a teenager or even a 20-something, you're going to tell your friends, and they may follow. I think
there is still a fascination with owning these pieces of work, isn't there? And there is still a fascination with owning certain artists. Now, in terms of the way that people are buying them, people are buying because they love them, but people are buying them. Obviously, there is a certain element that is an investment, but as it also is an investment, buying things to be part of your pension. I mean, obviously, we're valuers, we're not financial advisors, but how does that work, or what is your understanding of that, Jonathan?
Well, you could. I mean, you can. It is possible, and I checked this. I'm not an accountant, so yeah, I would advise you to take independent advice. But it is possible to put residential property, art, and wine into your pension. It's not illegal. But the downside is that having done so, the revenue then will apply significant tax to the resale. So it can go in, but then when you get it out again, I think that the penalties may be as much as 55% tax on the sale. So I think probably you're back to basics and collecting rather than putting these things into it. There doesn't seem to be a benefit. It seems a shame, and maybe it will change. So you can do it, but the benefits don't seem to be obvious. Don't let me put anybody off out there. Just buy the stuff. And then, you know, if you make a profit, well, the worst that can happen is that you might have some capital gains tax to pay. But hey, you know, you've made some money,
and you've lived with a painting that you love. And when I'm looking at paintings for people, and it hasn't made a huge profit, my first word of advice is you've lived with it for 20 years. Have you liked it? If so, you've almost, you know, you've had it for however many years virtually for free. And is that, that's not a bad thing.
And if you're buying at this sort of level of, let's say, under £10,000, then these items generally are counted as chattel. So you can just buy and sell quite happily. You don't have to worry about tax.
And, you know, aside from the items that we've discussed today, there is a plethora of items out there from other artists as well in that affordable kind of realm that you can buy by, you know, named artists. That you know, there are some really interesting things out there, be it signed prints, lithographs, and other things. And you can create a nice collection of your own without necessarily owning £1 million paintings.
Yes, as they say on the BBC, other artists are available. Yeah, there's you know, there's a slew of painters out there, and I think there is, even if just a little bit of something we talked about today is encouraging, and we demystify it, I think there's lots of fun to be had. And looking forward, I think your question is very good. Looking forward, let's all get used to living with art. There isn't, you know, there isn't anything to worry about. It's simply, and I think once you start, I think it's getting started often is the beginning, and you buy something and hopefully your friends and family will like it, then you're encouraged to buy more, and they're interested to see what you buy, and they may well pick up the baton themselves.
It's great because I think with art, and if you are starting out with buying artwork, you always kind of you kind of veer more towards things that you potentially understand. But I think as you spread out into things, you may take a little bit of a risk on something. But the great thing is, if you're buying limited edition prints, potentially when you're buying them when they're new, potentially from a gallery or something like that, there is that little bit of potential that they may increase in value. But for the vast majority of them, I think a good example was the Damien Hirst prints that he released during lockdown, and I bought a couple of those, which weren't expensive at all, and within the space of a year they've gone up in value by about 100% or so. And I think you can enjoy them, put them on the wall, and actually, you know, it's not a bad thing, is it?
No, and there's not much out there that you can do that with in many ways, is there? A lot of what we buy, whether it's food or furniture or anything, for the most part, it's or cars. They're depreciating assets. So that, you know, part of that, I think this whole series of webinars is to perhaps just demonstrate what's out there and what's fun to own.
Oh, definitely. Jonathan, again, we've gone completely over time, as I had anticipated, to be perfectly honest, but it's always an absolute pleasure talking to you. So thank you ever so much for joining us again. I don't think we've actually got any questions this week. So I'd like to say thank you ever so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week for our webinar with David Dallas, which I think, if you remember, it was delayed from a few weeks ago. And it's about the Dutch influence on the old masters during the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, which David Dallas, undoubtedly, as I'm sure Jonathan would agree, is probably the world's most acclaimed expert on that period. So it'll be fascinating talking to him about that and obviously going through those. So again, Jonathan, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Pleasure. And don't miss Dave next week. The nicest man in the art business, and absolutely a fountain of knowledge. Yes.
Indeed. Ladies, gentlemen, thank you ever so much. We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.